She called 911 herself. She told them exactly where to find him. What she never imagined was that the call would lead investigators straight back to her in the sun-bleached suburbs of Albuquerque and New Mexico, where rows of adobe-style homes sit behind manicured lawns and neighbors wave from driveways. The Chavez household looked, by every outward measure, like the picture of the American dream. Robert Chavez was a hard-working man, devoted to his family, well-liked at his job, and by most accounts a gentle presence in his neighborhood. His wife, Kristen Chavez, was sharp, composed, and seemingly devoted. They had built something together, a home, a family, a life that neighbors admired from across the street. But investigators would later learn that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in the most ordinary packaging. Behind the clean windows and trimmed hedges of that Albuquerque home, something had gone profoundly, irreversibly wrong. The story of Kristen Chavez is not simply a story about a murder. It is a story about the slow unraveling of a marriage, a calculated deception that stretched across months, and an investigation that pieced together the truth from fragments the killer never thought anyone would find. It is a story that begins not with a gunshot or a scream, but with a phone call and the stunning silence that followed. The call came in the early morning hours, but investigators would spend weeks asking one question: why did it take so long? It was a morning like any other in the Chavez neighborhood when Kristen placed the call to 911. Her voice, by multiple accounts, was strangely controlled for a woman who had allegedly just discovered her husband unresponsive. She reported that Robert was not breathing. She gave the address. She answered the dispatcher's questions, and then she waited. First responders arrived to find Robert Chavez dead. The scene, at first glance, suggested a medical emergency. A man who had perhaps suffered a sudden cardiac event or some other natural crisis in the night. Kristen stood at the periphery, composed in a way that would become a focal point of scrutiny in the weeks ahead. Neighbors who gathered at the edge of the property that morning later told investigators they remembered being struck by how calm she seemed, how measured, how utterly still. For the first responders, the immediate priority was documentation and notification. A death in the home of an apparently healthy man in his prime does not automatically trigger a homicide investigation, not right away. But the attending medical personnel noted something that gave them pause. The circumstances of Robert's death, the positioning of the body, certain physical indicators that they were not yet prepared to fully articulate, were enough to prompt a call to the medical examiner's office. A routine death was quietly reclassified as a death requiring further examination. That single reclassification would change everything. The medical examiner's report came back, and the word that appeared in the findings was not cardiac. It was not natural. It was the word no grieving spouse ever wants to hear, and the word every detective lives for. The Office of the Medical Investigator in New Mexico is tasked with determining the cause and manner of death in cases where the circumstances are unclear, suspicious, or sudden. When Robert Chavez's body was brought in for a full autopsy, the forensic pathologist assigned to the case began a meticulous, systematic examination of every organ, every tissue sample, every external marking on the body. What emerged from that examination was deeply troubling. Robert Chavez had not died of natural causes. The autopsy revealed the presence of a toxic substance in his system, a compound that did not belong there, present at levels that could not be explained by any legitimate medical treatment or accidental exposure. The manner of death was officially ruled a homicide. Robert Chavez had been poisoned. This finding immediately escalated the case from a tragic domestic loss to an active murder investigation. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, which has jurisdiction over unincorporated areas of the county, took the lead alongside the Albuquerque Police Department. Detectives were assigned. The quiet home on the quiet street was no longer a residence. It was a crime scene, Investigators returned with search warrants. Evidence technicians moved through every room methodically, cataloging, photographing, and collecting. They were looking for the substance identified in the autopsy, or any evidence of how it had been obtained and administered. What they found in that house would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. Among the items collected during the search was something investigators did not expect to find in a family home, and something Kristen Chavez could not explain away. The investigation into Robert Chavez's death quickly branched into multiple parallel tracks. Detectives interviewed neighbors, co-workers, friends, and family members on both sides. They obtained phone records, financial records, and electronic communications. They sought to reconstruct not just the night of Robert's death, but the months leading up to it, because in poisoning cases, the pattern of behavior before the act is often as revealing as the act itself. What they found was a marriage in profound, secret turmoil. Robert Chavez had confided to at least one close friend that things at home had not been right. There were arguments. There was distance. There was a growing tension that Robert had attributed, at least outwardly, to the ordinary stresses of married life. He had not suspected, as far as investigators could determine, that he was in any danger. That absence of suspicion, that trust, had made him fatally vulnerable. Detectives also discovered that Kristen had been conducting extensive online research in the weeks and months before Robert's death. Digital forensic investigators, working with warrants for the household computers and Kristen's personal devices, uncovered a search history that prosecutors would later describe as a roadmap to murder. The searches included inquiries into specific toxic substances, their detectability in autopsy, how quickly they acted, and how they might be administered without a victim's knowledge. It was the kind of research that, in isolation, might have an innocent explanation. But in the context of a dead husband, a toxicology report showing poisoning, and what investigators were simultaneously uncovering about Kristen's personal life, it was devastating. Then came the discovery that investigators had not anticipated, a secret that Kristen Chavez had been keeping, not just from Robert, but from everyone around her. As detectives dug deeper into the communication records pulled from Kristen's devices, a second narrative emerged, one running parallel to her marriage, hidden beneath the surface of her domestic life. Kristen Chavez had been involved in a relationship with another man. The communications between them were extensive, spanning months, and their content was, in the context of the investigation, revelatory. The messages painted a portrait of a woman who had grown not just disenchanted with her marriage, but consumed by a desire to escape it. Investigators found communications in which Kristen expressed frustration with Robert, spoke about a future with her paramour, and, in certain exchanges that prosecutors would later introduce as evidence, made statements that could be interpreted as discussions about removing Robert from the picture entirely. The existence of the affair provided what investigators call a motive architecture, the emotional and circumstantial framework that explains why a crime might have been committed. It did not prove guilt, but combined with the toxicology findings, the search history on the devices, and the physical evidence recovered from the home, it gave the investigation a coherent, damning shape. Detectives also began looking closely at the financial dimensions of the case. Robert Chavez had a life insurance policy. Kristen was the beneficiary. Investigators noted when the policy had been taken out and whether there had been any recent changes to its terms. They scrutinized the family's finances for signs of debt, pressure, or desperation that might have added a financial motive to an already volatile personal situation. What they found added yet another layer to the case against her. Many investigators now had motive. They had means. What they needed was the final, irrefutable piece, and the answer was sitting in evidence already collected from the Chavez home. Identifying the poison in Robert Chavez's system was only the first challenge for investigators. The second, and in many ways the more critical challenge, was proving where it came from and who had access to it. Certain toxic compounds are not things a person simply stumbles upon. They require either professional access, illicit procurement, or a deliberate effort to obtain them through channels that leave traces. Forensic chemists working with investigators conducted detailed analysis of the substance found in Robert's system. Their findings identified not just the compound itself, but its specific formulation, a level of detail that would later be important in tracing its origin. Meanwhile, detectives worked to establish a chain of custody. How had this substance entered the Chavez home, and who in the household could have obtained it? Investigators checked purchasing records, cross-referencing the substance and any related compounds against records associated with Kristen Chavez's name, any aliases, her email accounts, and her known associates. The digital trail, always a powerful ally in modern investigations, did not disappoint. Records emerged indicating that searches for obtaining the substance, not just reading about it, but actually acquiring it, had been conducted on Kristen's devices. Additionally, investigators canvassed storage areas within the home and found residue consistent with the identified compound in locations that were within Kristen's exclusive or primary access. The physical evidence, when combined with the digital trail and the toxicology results, formed an interlocking chain that prosecutors believed was unbreakable. With the evidence mounting, detectives made a decision. It was time to sit across from Kristen Chavez and ask her directly what had happened to her husband. Interrogations in homicide cases are among the most delicately constructed moments in an investigation. Skilled detectives know that the goal of an initial interview is rarely to extract a confession. It is to establish a baseline, observe behavior under pressure, and, crucially, to lock a suspect into a version of events that can later be tested against the evidence. Detectives met with Kristen Chavez for a formal interview in the days following Robert's death. She was cooperative, calm, and articulate, the same composed presence that had struck first responders on the morning of the discovery. She described the night before Robert's death in detail, explaining what they had eaten, when they had gone to sleep, and how she had found him unresponsive in the morning. Her account was internally consistent and delivered without visible distress. Investigators listened carefully. They asked open-ended questions, they let her talk, and then they began to probe the edges of her account, gently at first, then with more precision. They asked about Robert's health, whether he had any known conditions that might explain a sudden death. They asked about the medications in the house. They asked about the relationship, carefully watching her responses for any shift in composure. Kristen maintained her story. She did not crack. She did not contradict herself in ways that were immediately obvious. But detectives left that interview with something valuable, a detailed, recorded account of events that they could now compare point by point against the evidence they had collected. As forensic results continued to come in over the following weeks, the investigators returned to that recorded interview again and again. What Kristen had said and what the evidence showed were not the same story. The discrepancies were small at first, but they accumulated, and in homicide investigations, accumulation is everything. And there was one more piece of evidence investigators had not yet fully explored, and when they did, it would seal the case. Modern criminal investigations are, in many ways, fought and won in the digital realm. Phones, computers, and connected devices record the intimate geography of a person's thoughts and movements with a granularity that no human witness could ever replicate. Timestamps, locations, search queries, messages sent in the dark when a person believes no one is watching. For investigators in the Chavez case, the digital evidence had already been significant, But as forensic analysts continued to work through the trove of material collected from the household devices, they found something they had not yet accounted for. Within the data recovered from Kristen's devices were communications that went beyond the affair and beyond the online searches. There were messages sent and received in the period immediately surrounding Robert's death that investigators characterized as deeply incriminating. The specific content of these messages, the precise language used, the questions asked, the responses received, became central to the prosecution's case. Forensic analysts also recovered deleted content that Kristen had attempted to remove from her devices. Deletion, in the digital forensics world, is rarely as complete as the person doing the deleting believes. Fragments remain. Metadata persists. Timestamps survive. The act of deletion itself, especially when timed in correlation with a death, becomes evidence of consciousness of guilt. The recovered deleted content, when reconstructed by digital forensics experts, included material that corroborated the prosecution's theory of the case at multiple points. It added a timeline. It added specificity, and it closed several gaps that defense attorneys might otherwise have exploited. Investigators now had something rare in any homicide case, a nearly complete evidentiary picture. The question was no longer whether to arrest Kristen Chavez. It was how to build a case that no jury could walk away from. The decision to arrest and charge Kristen Chavez with the murder of her husband Robert was not made quickly or lightly. Prosecutors in New Mexico reviewed the full body of evidence assembled by detectives before moving forward. The toxicology findings, the digital forensics, the physical evidence from the home, the financial records, the communications with the man she had been seeing, and the accumulated discrepancies between her stated account and the facts on the ground. Kristen Chavez was arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder. The charges reflected the prosecution's position that the killing of Robert Chavez had not been impulsive or accidental. It had been planned, deliberate, and executed with a cold purposefulness that elevated it to the highest tier of criminal culpability. The arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood and through the wider community of people who had known the Chavez family. For many, the news was simply impossible to reconcile with the woman they thought they knew. For investigators, it was the culmination of weeks of painstaking work that began with a 911 call and ended, for now, with handcuffs. Defense attorneys entered the case and immediately began challenging the evidence on multiple fronts. They questioned the integrity of the digital forensics, the interpretation of the search history, and the reliability of the toxicology testing. They argued that the existence of an affair, while morally significant, did not constitute evidence of murder. They sought to introduce alternative explanations for each piece of evidence individually, hoping that if they could create doubt about any single link in the chain, the entire chain might be called into question. The prosecution prepared its counter-arguments with equal care. They knew that in a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, as most poisoning cases are by nature, the key to a conviction was not any single devastating exhibit, but the totality. The convergence of evidence from independent sources, each pointing to the same conclusion, was what they intended to lay before the jury. When the trial began, the courtroom became something else entirely. An arena where two versions of reality would collide and only one could survive. The trial of Kristen Chavez opened to a packed courtroom. Prosecutors began with an opening statement that walked the jury methodically through the landscape of the case, not as a collection of isolated facts, but as a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and a calculated tragic end. They promised to show not just that Robert Chavez had been murdered, but that his wife had planned it, executed it, and then called 911 and waited, composed, for the world to accept the fiction she had constructed. The forensic pathologist who had conducted Robert's autopsy was among the prosecution's early witnesses. Testifying in precise clinical language, the pathologist walked the jury through the findings of the examination: the presence of the toxic substance, its concentration in the body, the physiological effects that would have caused death, and the determination that no accidental or natural cause could account for what had been found. The manner of death, the pathologist confirmed under oath, was homicide. Digital forensics experts followed, presenting the evidence recovered from Kristen's devices in meticulous detail. They explained to the jury how data is stored, how it persists after deletion, and what the recovered material showed. The search history, the timeline of queries, the communications with her paramour, and the deleted content that forensic analysis had reconstructed. Defense attorneys cross-examined vigorously, probing for any uncertainty in the methodology, any possibility of contamination or misattribution. The experts held firm. Detectives who had conducted the initial investigation and search of the home testified about the physical evidence recovered, the residue found in locations consistent with Kristen's access, the items that corroborated the forensic findings, and the step-by-step account of how the investigation had unfolded. They described the interview with Kristen, the version of events she had provided, and the specific points at which her account conflicted with the physical and digital evidence. Then the prosecution called a witness that no one in the courtroom had been fully prepared for, and what that witness had to say changed the temperature of the entire trial. Among the prosecution's witnesses was the man with whom Kristen had been conducting her affair. His testimony was among the most anticipated and most complicated moments of the trial. He had not been charged with any crime. He cooperated with investigators, and what he told the jury about his conversations with Kristen in the months before Robert's death was, by multiple accounts in the courtroom, chilling. He testified about the nature of his relationship with Kristen, its depth, its duration, and its intensity. He testified about conversations in which Kristen had spoken about her marriage, about Robert, and about her desire to be free of the life she was living. He testified about specific communications that investigators had already recovered from Kristen's devices, corroborating the digital evidence with his own first-hand recollection. His account was consistent with what forensic analysts had found, and consistent, devastating detail by devastating detail. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility, suggesting he had motivation to minimize his own culpability, that he was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for favorable treatment, and that his recollection of conversations was shaped by self-interest. But prosecutors on redirect reinforced his testimony with the documentary evidence, showing the jury that what he had described in words was independently confirmed by the digital records on Kristen's own devices. Friends and family members of Robert Chavez also took the stand, painting a picture of a man who had trusted his wife completely, who had been unaware of her affair, and who had shown no signs of illness or distress in the weeks before his death that would suggest a natural cause was coming. Their testimony served to humanize Robert, to remind the jury that at the center of all the forensic and digital complexity was a man, a life, and a death that had been engineered without his knowledge or consent. When the defense presented its case, it gambled on one central strategy. It was a strategy that the prosecution had anticipated and prepared for. Defense attorneys for Kristen Chavez built their case around the concept of reasonable doubt, the foundational protection in the American criminal justice system, and the only shield available to a defendant facing a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They could not dispute that Robert was dead. They could not dispute that he had been poisoned. What they argued, with considerable skill and persistence, was that the evidence did not conclusively prove that Kristen was the one who had done it. They challenged the digital forensics, arguing that evidence gathered from shared household devices could not be attributed exclusively to any one user. They questioned whether the search history reflected genuine criminal intent, or simply the morbid curiosity of a woman who had become aware that her husband might be seriously ill. They pointed to the absence of direct witnesses. No one had seen Kristen administer anything to Robert. No fingerprints had been lifted from a smoking gun. Defense experts testified about alternative interpretations of the toxicological data, about the possibility of contamination in the testing process, and about the statistical limitations of forensic methods when applied to small sample sizes. These were technical arguments, carefully constructed to introduce uncertainty into the minds of jurors who were not scientists. On the question of the affair, defense attorneys attempted to contextualize it as irrelevant to the murder charge, acknowledging the moral dimension while arguing that unhappy marriages do not produce murderers, and that extramarital involvement was common enough to carry no meaningful inferential weight in a capital criminal case. Kristen Chavez, they argued, was a woman who had made personal mistakes. She was not a killer. Kristen did not testify in her own defense. The decision, made after careful deliberation with her legal team, was a calculated one. In a case where her composure had already been scrutinized by investigators, placing her on the stand would have exposed her to cross-examination from prosecutors who had spent weeks preparing to dismantle precisely the kind of measured, controlled performance that had defined her behavior throughout. The jury received the case, and then the waiting began. The most agonizing hours in any courtroom, when all the evidence, all the testimony, all the argument collapses down to 12 people in a room and a question that has only 2 answers. Prosecutors delivered their closing argument with the confidence of a team that knew the strength of what they had assembled. They did not ask the jury to take any single piece of evidence on faith. Instead, they returned to the strategy that had defined the entire case: convergence. Each individual element, the toxicology, the digital forensics, the affair, the financial motive, the discrepancies in Kristen's account, the physical evidence from the home, might, in isolation, be challenged or explained away. But the jury was asked to consider all of it together, to ask themselves what the probability was that all of these independent streams of evidence pointed to an innocent woman. The prosecution's closing argument walked through each piece of evidence in sequence, reminding the jury of the specific testimony attached to each, and connecting the dots in a way that was designed to feel not like legal argument, but like common sense. They reminded the jury of the deleted searches. They reminded them of the toxicology. They reminded them of the communications with her paramour, of the insurance policy, of the morning of the 911 call, and the composure that had struck everyone present. Defense attorneys, in their own closing, implored the jury to resist the narrative pull of the prosecution's story. A good story, they argued, is not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The American standard of justice does not convict on probability or plausibility. It requires certainty, and certainty, they argued, was what the prosecution had failed to deliver. But the jury had sat through weeks of testimony. They had watched the evidence unfold, piece by piece. They had heard from the forensic pathologist, the digital forensics experts, the detectives, the man who had known Kristen's secrets. They had watched Kristen Chavez sit through it all in the same composed, measured stillness that had defined her from the beginning. The jury deliberated. Hours passed. Then the word came, and the courtroom fell absolutely silent. After deliberations, the jury returned to the courtroom. The forewoman stood. The judge asked for the verdict, and in a clear voice, she read the words that ended the legal chapter of Robert Chavez's story. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The verdict reflected the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's central argument that the death of Robert Chavez had not been an accident, not a natural tragedy, not a misfortune of biology or fate. It had been planned. It had been executed, and it had been carried out by the woman who had shared his home, his life, and his trust. For the investigators who had spent weeks reconstructing the truth from fragments, the toxicology reports, the recovered data, the financial records, the testimony of people who had known the Chavez family, the verdict was the culmination of work that had begun with a quiet morning, an unusual 911 call, and the professional instinct of first responders who had looked at the scene before them and felt, in the wordless language of experience, that something was not right. For the family of Robert Chavez, the verdict offered what verdicts in murder trials always offer, not closure, which is a word that belongs to therapy rather than law, but something more precise and more modest, the formal acknowledgement, made by 12 of his fellow citizens, that what had happened to Robert Chavez was not natural, was not accidental, and was not without consequence. The case of Kristen Chavez stands as a testament to the power of modern forensic investigation, to what becomes possible when toxicology, digital forensics, financial analysis, and traditional detective work converge on a single question. It is a case that reminds investigators, prosecutors, and the public alike that the most carefully constructed deceptions leave traces, that the digital age makes secrecy exponentially more difficult, that deleted messages are not really deleted, and that the smallest decision, to search, to purchase, to communicate, to wait in composed silence on the morning a husband is found dead, can become, in the hands of determined investigators, the thread that unravels everything.